Hi, my name's Liam Maxwell. I'm the Director of Government Transformation at AWS, and welcome to this AWS Institute event. We're going to be talking today about data classification, which may sound like a very dry topic, but actually it's right at the heart of the way that you can help modernize your public services. Get this right, and you can move at speed. I'm going to be talking really from first-hand experience, because I was the CTO of the British government when we introduced the new approach to this. And joining me today is Ben Ung, who joined me then from the security side of the shop to help us bring together these policies. So you're going to be hearing today quite a lot from Ben about how to make this work and how to make data classification one of the things that you can use to accelerate your transformation, to help your transformation go, and particularly to make security something that enables your transformation rather than something you feel is in the way of your transformation. Welcome to the AWS Institute. My name's Liam Maxwell. I'm the Director of Government Transformation at AWS. And I'm really pleased to be joined today by Ben Ung. Ben is the Chief Security Officer at Sage, but he's also got a distinguished career in government where he led the security reforms that really helped us drive the technology and digital reforms across the British government. Ben, welcome to the AWS Institute. Do you want to just tell us about Sage and then about your role within the British government?
Yeah, of course, and thanks for having me. So at Sage, as you say, I'm the Chief Information Security Officer. Before that, I've been at Sage a couple of years. Before that, I was in government for 16 years, where I was at the tail end responsible for all aspects of government security, including information security, for about 400,000 civil servants across 50-odd government departments.
So Ben, the scale of that role within government is very large, and the reforms you brought through fundamentally changed the way that we approach technology. Do you want to talk us through the situation that you and I discovered when we started our roles?
I think it was 2011 or 2012. There was a big reform agenda in the UK government to transform the way that we use technology and digital services, how we serve the public, and that reform was led by one of the ministers of the day, Francis Maude. And in parallel, the security community, or in the Cabinet Office where I was at the time, we'd been looking at which security changes needed to occur in order to enable that much broader digital transformation. And one of those changes, which I think is what we're going to talk about most today, is the change of the classification system. Changing a 6-level classification system that was originated from the kind of Cold War era to a 3-level system that was much more attuned and optimized for the digital changes that you were trying to deliver.
Yeah, we had quite a lot of reform that was needed. We had 6 security settings, I remember, and we got those down to 3. And although that sounds like a strange bureaucratic change, that was a real mindset change for the whole government. At the top of that, you had secret and top secret, which, Ben, could you just explain what those areas were used for?
Yeah, so we had these 6 levels. It went from unclassified, protect, restricted, confidential, secret, top secret. As you say, those top 2 levels were preserved or reserved for our kind of national security business. So, our sensitive intelligence and defence business, sensitive diplomacy, and so on. But then below that, the subsequent levels were all about, the kind of the vast bulk or the majority of government business, in terms of public sector delivery, policy making.
It was all the areas where government's actually acting like a professional services organisation, giving public services to the people. So accessibility was one of the big things there, but also the security around that was still, as you described it, sort of Cold War.
Yeah, I mean, what we found is, as I said, the system had been relatively, or predominantly actually unchanged from even pre-Cold War, from the end of the Second World War, and then in some cases, predating even that. And it had been designed for a kind of paper-based system, filing cabinets and paper records. And as computers had become more and more a part of the way that government worked, we sort of shoehorned this sort of, this paper-driven system into the IT that we were using. We had, ended up with 6 levels of IT, 6 different rule sets, 6 different ways of working, And when you transplanted that over, an enormous organization like the government at the time, you found, or you created, a highly complex web of interoperability that fundamentally, didn't work because we created, these different layers. And where one bit couldn't speak to another because they didn't have the right systems and so on. And it was a real mess.
And I think even the map of who did what was an amazing jigsaw puzzle, or spaghetti junction, I think we used to call it.
Yeah, because I think over time, again, completely unconsciously, I think, without any kind of intelligent mind driving it, we'd had, a number of organisations spring up across the landscape, all of which had a different piece of the kind of security puzzle in terms of oversight, responsibility, or accountability. And so there was no one place where it all got brought together where you could make a decision. So in our case, if you wanted to change the classification system, you'd think, well, there must be someone you can go to who can just make that decision. Well, there wasn't. There was probably 5 or 10 people that ultimately, collectively had to agree. And that was one of the big challenges. So, as well as changing the system, working out how it would all function, a lot of the work was about driving accountability, identifying people to be responsible, and then making that how we worked from then on. When you put all of that together in aggregate, you've got a very, very busy picture. Kind of trying to find the one person who could sign off a change like this was like a needle in a haystack.
I don't know if it was you, but there was a phrase I remember being used. I think you did use it, which was, it's the Ghostbusters question, which is who you're going to call. And that led to the consolidation of all of this as well. So the simplification of that into the National Cyber Security Centre was a real reform that changed the operations massively and made it much, much simpler. But Ben, for our viewers today, I mean, what should they be looking for? Because lots of governments are like this. Lots of government organisations turn into, have all these large bureaucracies. What are the things you try to look for, and why did we think this case was such a good one to focus on?
My first thing I'll say is that if you're a public sector organisation or another government, go and have a look at your classification system. I mean, go do that tomorrow, because if you haven't changed it for some years, I can bet it's at the root of lots of your problems. But it's more a representation of the kind of challenge, I think, or the kind of focus that other organisations should be applying. So go and look for the small things that are littered across your organisation, the small policies or the rules or the received wisdom, which either individually or cumulatively are stopping you doing what you need to do or what you want to change. In many cases, it is the insignificant. It's the thing that's been locked away in a cupboard for some years, with no one looking at it, which is actually at the root of problems. And I think, the first advice I would give is to go and find that thing. Probably is a classification policy, but it might be something else, and probably to do with security.
Okay, start small, but start with something significant that's going to help people move. And I think the other thing, Ben, is also make sure that you've got the leadership in place. You showed tremendous leadership in making sure that these reforms worked, because you knew the detail and you understood, you dived deep into understanding what needed to be done, but also insisted that we kept going, and we kept the momentum behind it. And I think also having that from a political level also worked, didn't it?
Yeah, the sponsorship was absolutely key. And, I think probably my second lesson then would be, you've got to sell this idea, this concept to someone that can actually support you and provide you with the cover you need in order to make the change when the going gets tough. When the barriers start springing up, you're going to need someone to come in behind you. And we were in a small team at the time. We were fully bought in, but it felt like sometimes an overwhelming amount of opposition. It was an exhausting change, and it took us 3 or 4 years just to get to the point where we could reissue a new policy. Never mind actually implement it and kind of follow through and make it real. And so you need that sponsorship, and you also need someone that you've made that commitment to, who is going to keep driving you forward. When perhaps it all seems too hard. So
keep it simple. Government should run at the right level of security for the operation. So if you're in the public service delivery function, you're running at the same security as an insurance company or a bank. And that means that you can start to use simpler governance. It also means you can start to use simpler technology and move to the cloud. And that was one of the great things that this brought, was the ability to move to the cloud and be more secure. which was the virtuous circle that we were really looking for in these reforms?
Yeah, at the root of this was we had a government policy, a cloud-first policy, that we couldn't actually deliver on because the cloud was in effect outside the rules, and the classification change was one of those rules. And so, to reconcile that situation, we had to make the change. And, as you sort of intimate, there was a deep suspicion of the cloud, particularly in the security community and government at the time. We just couldn't understand it in terms of our security rules. We couldn't, transplant the way that we expected things to happen into these, enormous cloud providers that operated in a fundamentally different way. And that had become a kind of long-running problem. We tried engaging with them, we tried giving them our rules, we tried to, make them understand how we needed them to work. None of it was, working because, ultimately, and this is what they would say to us, is that if we do all of the things that you want us to do, you will no longer want to work with us. All of the things you value about us are the things that we do differently. So when we looked at it very deeply, we found that actually they were solving the same security problems, but in very different ways. And if you just take it to, take it away from the kind of tactical, and you start looking at actually what outcomes are you looking for, and how do these providers and these organisations get to the same outcomes, you can find a lot of common ground. And in many cases, as we found, and subsequently being the case certainly with AWS, is these companies are doing things in a much better way than we ever were. They are fundamentally, spending a great deal of money, time, and effort and brain power to solve these problems in new and exciting ways.
So Ben, do you want to summarize what you did to make those changes?
So basically over a period of some years, 3 years in total, I think it was, we consolidated 6 different classification levels into 3. And so we preserved secret and top secret, and we had created a new classification, which we called official, which constituted the vast bulk of government business. So we no longer relied on, having lots of different levels of IT systems. We decided that we wanted one level that was based around kind of industry best practice. So the same level of security that a well-run kind of global organization in the private sector might require. And we baked that into that single classification and put far more onus on individual users, civil servants and people in the public sector, to use their judgment much more actively to decide how information should and shouldn't be used. And then in parallel, we simplified the governance and the accountability and the organizational situation around that change. So as you said, we consolidated a lot of the cybersecurity organizations into the National Cybersecurity Centre. So we had a kind of one-stop shop for cybersecurity advice and excellence. And then in the Cabinet Office, in the sort of centre of government, we created a Chief Security Officer role that sat at the time, we call it Director General level, a very senior level, where who effectively owned government security in the round as a single function for government, and therefore we could set the rules, make policy changes like this in the future without having to go and speak to 30, 40 different people. There was one place where that all kind of converged.
Great. So make it simple. And Ben, just as a final takeaway, what would you suggest to our colleagues who are looking at this saying, look, I want to make my reforms work? What would be your suggestion to them to get their programs working?
Yeah, so I think with security changes, particularly if you're not a security person, which many of these people won't be, it's very easy to be fobbed off because it's such an opaque environment. You can be told very easily that what you're trying to do is impossible. It's too risky. It will encourage or enable a kind of doomsday of cyber attacks to fall upon you. There's always going to be a reason why you can't do something if the security rule says you shouldn't. The really important thing that I want people who haven't done this sort of thing before to remember or take away is that there is nothing in any of this which isn't up for grabs. You might not find that you can solve or fix everything, but everything is challengeable. It's all a question of risk appetite and whether or not the business truly wants to do something when it's completely cognizant or conscious of all of the implications. So with security, if you're getting told no, as you were, and I I think you'll remember we solved some of this by we gave you the highest level of vetting clearance in government so that you could have these conversations with the no brigade on common ground, on the same level. And that's exactly what you have to do. You have to meet these people on their own terms.
And I have to say, Ben, one of the big things about that was that what I discovered was that all the people that we thought were trying to say no really wanted to say yes. It was just coming together that enabled us to make that work.
Yeah, exactly.
And that was one of the big, my big lesson from this as well, as you could probably tell, is that if you work with security people and work with your security teams, they want to help you much more than it might be apparent.
Yeah, exactly.
So do take it on board.
Exactly.
Great. Ben, that's been fantastic. Thanks so much for having us today. Thanks so much for coming along. And I hope we've managed to explain one of those great myths of government, is that security can in fact be an enabling force for your reforms.
Thanks very much, Liam.